Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Breakers, a podcast about shipwrecks, loss, and lessons learned from maritime disasters. My name's Tanner, and in just a minute, I'll be joined by my co host, Taylor. But before we get to that, we do have a new patron to thank. So I want to say thank you to Bill for joining us on board, and we hope you enjoy the bonus episodes over on Patreon. And then something I've been meaning to do for a while. As a general reminder regarding the bonus stuff, if you're a Patreon supporter, there's a few ways that you can get to those extra episodes. First, you can listen to those directly on Patreon in your browser. We post some other stuff on the actual Patreon website occasionally, extra notes, photos, things like that. You can also listen to the episodes there. You can send us a message there too. You can download the Patreon app on your phone and listen to the episodes there. The Patreon app's a little bit clunky, in my opinion, but you can listen there. Probably the easiest way, you can copy and paste the link to the RSS feed into your podcast app and listen just like you would to any of your other shows. I know that process is pretty simple through Apple Podcasts. I'm not sure about through some of the other options there. But there's a lot of cool stuff over there, so we just want to make sure that you are getting all of that stuff in a way that's most convenient for you and makes it easier to listen. And if you've got trouble accessing any of the bonus material, just send us a message through Patreon or any of our social media. With that, I guess I will bring in Taylor to the conversation. How's it going?
Pretty good. It's a little kind of humid, rainy day here today, but still got out and had some fun. How about you?
We're like back to fall basically here today.
Oh, really?
It's 58 degrees, overcast, rainy.
That sounds perfect. The Packers are kicking off at 4:30.
Paluch was looking at me. He was laying by the sliding glass door, and he was looking up at me like I could do something about the sun. But it's gone today, so it'll be back, I'm sure. But next week, it's supposed to be a little bit cooler than it's been. So very nice.
Nice.
No one should be collapsing in the heat like that beefeater.
Yeah, right.
I don't know, for anyone unaware, beefeater is just what they're called. That's not a slur against British people. What have you been up to this past week?
I've actually watched a couple movies this weekend, which is rare. I'm not a huge movie person.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I just always feel like I could do something else.
Yeah.
Last night, we watched Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, and I actually really liked it. It was like visually a really fun movie. The animation style was fun, and I thought they presented a pretty like interesting concept for like the Spider-Man story and like how and why there's multiple Spider-Men, if you will.
Have you seen the other Spider-Man movies?
No, like before this, the last Spider-Man movie I saw had Tobey Maguire in it.
Oh, like the original of the new ones?
Yeah, that's like the last one I'd seen before this one, but it was good. Like I'm into it, so I think the second one comes out in a month, so I'll probably check that out.
Cool.
And then today we decided to split up and have a little like girls' day / guys' day, and so we went over and watched Transformers, the new one that just came out, Rise of the Beasts. Which is kind of cool because it had some of the Beast Wars characters in it.
That's cool. I was gonna say, like, is that what this movie is getting into? Is like the Beast Wars stuff?
I wish it had been more like the old animated show that we watched, because that was really one of the only things like this I think we watched. I don't remember watching a ton of Transformers, but I do remember Beast Wars really well, and it was cool to see some of the characters in there and everything. It was good. I mean, it was fun. It's what you think. It's not exactly a groundbreaking movie,
right?
But I mean, it was a fun reason to eat popcorn at 10 o'clock in the morning. And then after that, we went and had some brunch at a pub near our house. Had the full English breakfast this afternoon, so that was good. You can't appropriate culture if it like is your culture, right? I think that's how that works.
You can do what you want with it.
Yeah, historically. Yeah, it's always fun to get out and have a little fun on a Sunday morning like that and spend a little quality time. How about you?
Yeah, mine is also a movie. We watched the movie Skinamarink, which I had like seen as ads and discussion for when it was coming out, and it had just kind of been on my list of something I wanted to see. Some interesting aspects, but I think my professional opinion is that it was like an hour and 15 minutes too long.
How long of a movie was it?
I don't know. It was probably like an hour and 40 minutes. 2 hours maybe.
So this would have played better as like a short.
It would have made a great, like, unsettling short film. It
Mm-hmm.
kind of reminds me of the cinema of the unsettling that Gabe plays in The Office. And it would have been a very memorable, very, I think, impactful short film if that's all I had to watch. But I think it was one of those where there's just a lot of like tension building. There's like a few moments you could call legitimately scary, like it's building to something and then it just doesn't. It's I don't know. I always kind of see those movies. It's kind of a cop out. Like you never actually have to produce something for the audience.
Mm-hmm.
You never have to, show me the monster, show me the ghost at some point
it's
at the end
like
of it.
Signs, basically.
Like you've got to show me something. And it sucked because we even had a friend over that night. And so like wanted to find something that would be entertaining. That would be cool. And it sucked. It was terrible, but it was a good movie to talk during.
Uh-huh.
And I'm sure a film person would probably say, well, that's why you didn't enjoy the movie because you were talking the whole time. But it wasn't.
Yep. But
good.
The funny thing about movies I do enjoy is I don't tend to talk over them.
It wasn't good. I didn't think. I didn't like it.
That scenario totally reminds me of the time I was super hyped to watch Chernobyl Diaries. And that was just a god-awful horror movie, too. Like, I just remember after it was over, I just remember being like, sorry, everyone. Sorry I've wasted our time.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't even like the bad kind you can laugh at.
Right.
It was just like the bad kind that was too serious.
That's kind of skin over ink. It's not that it was like poorly executed. I think it did like what it was trying to do well, but it just didn't impact me whatsoever.
Right. Well, that's been Movie Corner, a new segment on the show.
Yeah. That's what the people tune in for.
That was unintentional. We did not intentionally have two or more than two, but 3 movie reviews for you.
So I guess that leads us to the main part of our episode. Do you have any jokes before we start?
I don't think so. Do I need some jokes?
Or maybe taking from donkeys an animal fact or two.
Are we going to need animal facts?
This one's not like, it's not like this one's especially gruesome or anything. It's just very recent and there's a lot of like firsthand accounts. There's also a good deal of video from this one. And when there is, I don't usually watch the videos if there's video of any of the things we discuss. It's not something I typically enjoy doing. For this one, I did want a little bit more context just to visualize this. So yeah, I mean, this one is, it's going to be one of our downer episodes for sure, I think.
I do have, let's see here. The best I can do is IMDb facts about Transformers Rise of Beasts. I do have that page open right now.
All right, read me one of those.
Let's see here. During filming in Peru, a Peruvian child showed his Transformers drawings to director Stephen Capel Jr., and in response, Capel invited him to the premiere and paid to renovate his school's roof.
That's a good story. I like that.
There you go. That's a positive going into this.
He showed them the early cut and he's like, no, see, this is what they look like. Okay, that's a good start. We might need another one at the end. Let's get into this. So we are going somewhere that we've never been to on the show this week, and that's Indonesia.
Kind of surprised we haven't visited Indonesia just because it is such a maritime nation and there's so much going on there.
There's several nations trying to, at least get our toes wet in because it's somehow we have avoided them so far. Brazil is another one, a nation with a long maritime history that we haven't been to yet.
Are you saying we've only focused on North American and European shipwrecks?
Heavily. I mean, those are the most accessible ones, but there's lots of other ones we can do.
Right.
We've done a fairly good job being a diverse shipwreck show, I think. So Indonesia, a nation with a massive maritime connection historically and in the modern shipping industry. Very appropriate, a place that we should be looking into. The specific area of Indonesia that we'll be discussing for this story is Lake Toba, and that's in the northwestern portion of the island of Sumatra.
I will say that if you had told me this is what the location of our first story in Indonesia would be, I'd be like, not the Pacific Ocean?
Mm-mm.
Surprising.
Nor the Indian.
Or Indian Ocean, I suppose. You'd go either way. Is it even? It's not even in the Pacific Ocean, is it? Is any part of it?
Technically, no, I don't think.
Hmm.
I don't know if there's a hard and fast division there.
There's like hardline Pacific
water is
or
tough
Pacific Ocean borders
that way.
Yeah, right.
So while Indonesia is made up of thousands of islands, we were talking before the show, there's like 17,000 islands that are part of Indonesia. Only about 10,000 of those are populated, I think, but still, that's pretty impressive.
Yeah, that is.
Sumatra is the largest island entirely in Indonesia, and it's the 6th largest island in the world.
Is that where coffee comes from?
Some of it.
Okay. I was going to say, I tend to like the Sumatra blends and stuff.
Java is over there too.
That's true.
So if you're looking at Indonesia on a map, Sumatra is the large island that's furthest west in the chain, running kind of partially parallel with the Malay Peninsula, which is separated by the Sunda Strait, and it reaches up kind of into the Indian Ocean proper. So Lake Toba, our location today, is in the province of North Sumatra, and this area is inhabited largely by the closely related but distinct Batak peoples. And reading about the Batak in the week or so leading up to this, the Batak are a really interesting subset of the Indonesian population.
Mm-hmm.
They've got their distinct languages and cultures. This whole area of the world is massively diverse from a language and culture perspective. You look at like the island of Borneo or New Guinea, any of the islands in Indonesia, you've got this enormous range of not just languages, but you've got, multiple language families crammed into very small areas.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the island of Taiwan has like 9 indigenous language families on it.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Mm-hmm.
That there's just that much.
And one of the things that makes the Batak distinct from, the bulk of Indonesia is that they're predominantly Christian.
Okay.
And this is kind of one of those things also where these numbers are so big that you kind of lose track of things. Although Indonesia is known for having the largest Muslim population in the world, it also has the highest population of Christians in any Muslim majority nation, with about 28 million. That's about 10% of the population.
That's not an insignificant number when you start to talk about like as a block of people within a country, especially if, for the most part, they're concentrated in one area.
Well, and that's the thing. They're also not all concentrated here. This is just a particular group that is heavily concentrated. All throughout the archipelago, you see some provinces that are majority Christian and some provinces that have almost none. And the other, I guess, kind of surprising thing when I was reading about this is that there's also a fairly even split between Catholicism and Protestantism.
I didn't even think about that part of it. That is interesting.
It's not like one particular thing took hold and spread. This was a heavily proselytized area. You had, Dutch missionaries and other missionaries all over the place in Indonesia, and in some places that, remains a very big part of the culture. So yeah, I think that's something that it surprised me a little bit. I knew that there was a Christian population in Indonesia, but you kind of hear that statistic of it being the largest Muslim population in the world. You kind of assume it's a monolith, and like most countries, like every country, it's not. The national motto of Indonesia is actually unity in diversity, Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, quoting from Tourism's Impact on Toba Batak Ceremony by Rithaony Hutajulu.
The state has adopted a policy of preserving tradition and culture to maintain ethnic boundaries and diversity among all Indonesian ethnic groups. However, what is chosen to be preserved is not supposed to contradict Indonesian national ideology. Diversity is thus encouraged to the extent that it does not conflict with unity. This policy goes along with the government's aim to promote tourism, in which Indonesia's ethnic and cultural diversity is the most important tourist object.
So something that does play a role in the upcoming story is the role of tourism in Indonesia. That's a massive revenue source for the nation of Indonesia. They have so much cool stuff, really diverse culturally, geographically, all kinds of things. So it's interesting reading about the Indonesian government's, trying to basically have that balance of, we want people to know about these different cultures and things that they can see and experience, but we want everything to stay in the umbrella of this nation that we've formed. And even the formation of Indonesia is interesting because, they're a Dutch colony up until, obviously they have massive history before that, but recent history, they're colonized by the Dutch up until World War II, when they're occupied by the Japanese. And the Japanese are somewhat liberators, but that's never really the case. And so they operate there. And then, after the defeat of Japan, the Dutch kind of like the French in Indochina come back and say, hey, like, sorry about that. We're back, guys. We can get things back to normal. And that's really when Indonesia becomes an independent nation, is in that sort of wedge period. And, there's quite a lot of fighting that goes into them winning their independence.
Wouldn't you love to be in some of those meetings in Vietnam or in Indonesia where it's like, hey, so we're back.
Actually, we're good,
Yeah.
And even within Indonesia's history, there's been regional conflicts where you've had regions like the northern tip of Sumatra, the Aceh region. There was a brutal, bloody war they fought for independence from Indonesia that was unsuccessful.
It's interesting that just because a lot of this is happening in more modern times and more recent, that we look at this as like this war-torn part of the world. Whereas I'm still reading that Wars of the Roses book. Like France and things that will become part of France are all fighting themselves all the time. England fights itself all the time. Like, I feel like a lot of these are just kind of the things that happen when countries are forming or nations are organizing. So it is interesting to see that reflected in a little more modern times.
Yeah, you see the issues with when you have this colonial power says all of this is ours, and then suddenly they're gone. What do those pieces do? Do they all break into smaller pieces, or do they stick together and say, well, okay, we can stay together, but just independently? Fascinating stuff going on here. We will be coming back to Indonesia again. Lots of things we can cover here. Oh, another cultural note as we get into the incident, the aftermath. It's very common for Indonesians to only use one name. So some of the quotes we use will be attributed to just a single name. Don't worry, you're not missing a previous reference to someone that you're supposed to know already. So Lake Toba is really interesting also geologically and topographically. It's in the caldera of a supervolcano.
Interesting.
It's the deepest volcanic lake in the world. It's estimated at about 1,600 feet at its deepest.
Dang.
And for comparison, that's about 300 feet deeper than the deepest part of Lake Superior.
Interesting, because looking at it on the map, it doesn't particularly look that special. It's not like an impressive lake on the map.
It isn't at all. And it really tells you how unique it is in its formation, because there's not a lot of space in there, and it drops fast.
Right.
To its 1,600-ish feet. So it's about 60 miles long and it's about 20 miles wide, although it's kind of hard to see that looking at it on the map, because most of the center of the lake is occupied by the island of Samosir. So it doesn't even really look like a lake almost, because it's got this huge island in the middle of it.
Yeah, it is such an interesting geographic formation. It is very unique.
And actually, fun fact, so this is the island of Sumatra, a large island.
Yes.
On that island, you've got Lake Toba.
Yes.
In the middle of Lake Toba, there's the island of Samosir.
Please tell me we got more.
On Samosir, there's a lake. There's a lake on the island of Samosir.
Does it have an island?
There's no island in the middle of it, I don't think. So, it's great. So the island's accessible by a bridge from the west side. It's just a very, very narrow strip of water dividing it on the west side.
It looks like a canal. Honestly.
Yeah, and I don't even know. I was trying to figure this out. I can't even tell if that's a natural division or if that is man-made.
If it was natural, it didn't look like this when it was natural.
Right.
It's definitely been channeled and stuff.
So yeah, this big island in the middle of this volcanic caldera lake, the middle of Samosir rises to an elevation of almost 5,600 feet, or about 1,700 meters. So an enormous change in elevation.
Mm-hmm.
If you were to drain this, it would be insane. So we mentioned the west side of the lake is divided by that narrow strip of water. And on the eastern side of the island, there's several ferry routes that cover the 4 to 5 miles across to the mainland, depending on where you cross. And it's one of these ferry routes that we'll be discussing today. Lake Toba, as we mentioned, tourism. This is a big tourist destination, domestically and internationally. Just looking on Google Maps, you can see quite a few, hotels, resorts, all around the lake.
As far as tourism goes, I don't know if you did as much research. Where are these tourists coming from? Like, is it a lot of Russian, Chinese, that kind of thing? Is the international?
I know that a lot of Chinese tourists visit like Malaysia and Indonesia, so that's probably a significant portion of them. There's a lot of domestic tourism also, and then just other travel needs that we'll see at this particular time of year.
Yeah, I just know it's not like an A-list necessary place like for people in the West as far as where you think of as going, but like I do know people go there, and do vacation there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, it's the kind of place when I think of someone visiting Bali. It's the kind of thing you'd see in a movie for like the hyper rich might visit there, but I don't know, like maybe I'm misinterpreting the people's perception about it. But for me, that sounds like somewhere that you'd only go if you were like super, super rich, if you were an American. And it, like a lot of countries, they have their issues. There's certain parts of Indonesia that are not really advisable to travel to for various reasons, political unrest, things like that. The area of Lake Toba has been one of those places in the past. So yeah, I mean, it's a mix of who is actually visiting this place. But again, a lot of that is domestic travel also. Oh, and as we're used to seeing with any of our ferry episodes, this also contributes to how crowded these get, since each visitor you take across is more money in the pocket of the ferry operators. So, into the incident. Our story takes place on Monday, the 18th of June, 2018, which is exactly 5 years ago if you're listening to this on the release day.
Was that intentional?
No, it was entirely unintentional, 100%. But as I was writing the episode, I realized how these dates were going to fall with the recording and release schedule. So,
nice.
This might be the first time that's happened.
I think so.
So the vessel at the center of our story today is the ferry Sinar Bangun. So she was about 60 feet or 18 meters in length.
Okay, that's not very big.
She's not a big ship, not a big boat, and about 18 feet or 5.5 meters in beam. So Sinar Bangun ran a route between Simanindo, near the northern end of the island of Samosir, and Tigaras on the mainland. That's the word I'm using. I don't know if mainland is the proper word here because it's another island, just a bigger one. I'm going to call
sub-mainland.
I'm going to call Sumatra the mainland in this episode. So this ferry route is basically a straight line across a 4-mile stretch of the lake. And this is one reason I wanted to watch the videos, because like it's very hard to conceptualize this because everything looks very close together.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost hard to imagine how you'd have enough time to have an incident here.
It just makes me immediately think of going back from Mackinac Island.
Yes, exactly.
And that is how you have enough time.
Yeah. It's longer than you think. So due to the volcanic nature of the lake, although that's a pretty narrow stretch, that depth increases dramatically over that space. That'll play a role too in the aftermath of the incident. So yesterday I showed you a picture of the vessel we're discussing today. You've had some time to think about it. What do you think the listed capacity of that vessel is?
I'm going to say 90 people.
You are thinking like an Indonesian ferry operator. The listed capacity is 43.
Oh.
In terms of the number of actual spaces.
Okay.
I think that it's supposed to have. So the number that's given for all of these is 43. Some of them it says 45 for some of these ferries, but that's kind of the general number for the boats of this size. Now there is the space. Also, you'll see these pictures. There's a lot of space for motorbikes. So like kind of ringing the outside, you'll see them, all these bikes lined up. But yeah, we're working from a listed capacity of 43.
Okay. I'll keep that number in mind.
thinking that going forward. So the date of this incident is significant, not just because it's the 5-year anniversary. In the year 2018, the Muslim holy month of Ramadan lasted from May 15th to June 14th. So that means on the 18th, we're still kind of in peak travel season here. You've got people traveling to visit and be with family during this time. So this is a time when you'd have more people than you might usually have. So that being the case, when Sinar Bangun left the dock at Simanindo, she was loaded with almost 200 people.
That's a lot more than 90 even.
Plus the motorbikes that a lot of the passengers are crossing with. It's kind of amazing how many bikes or scooter type stuff they're able to fit onto this thing.
I've been watching a man in Vietnam that operates a ferry across the river carry motorbikes and people. And it comes up on my TikTok live. And I don't know, I can like sit there and watch that for like 15 minutes. It's kind of calming.
It's really cool.
Yeah. I have no idea what he's saying, but he has a fun time doing it.
So a little after 5 p.m., and this is about 20 minutes into the trip across the lake. After taking heavy waves, the ferry begins to list to starboard and take on water.
Is this lake particularly noted for bad weather or like being like particularly treacherous?
It doesn't say that this is not the first ferry incident on Lake Toba.
Mm-hmm.
And in Indonesia, they're quite common. There's tons of ferry incidents we could cover from Indonesia. In the video of this, if you check it out, you can see how dark and angry the sky looks. So you can definitely get the sense of there's the potential for pretty scary weather on this lake. So that leads to passengers panicking, more waves. They prevent the boat from righting itself, with some wave heights reported as 5 to 6 feet. So 1.5 to 2 meters.
Okay. So that's like, I mean, that's big waves, but like I've been out in those before, in a fairly small boat. And like, it isn't fun, but you would expect something that carries passengers to be able to deal with it. You know what I mean?
And if you look at how the passengers are distributed on this also, on the inside, you've got 2 decks with passengers. And then you also have what kind of looks to be a kind of jerry-rigged top deck on top of the roof of the ferry.
It's definitely not professionally done.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be. That's not included in the official capacity listings. So survivor Juwita Sumbayak described the ferry shaking and then suddenly capsizing.
Many passengers without a life jacket jumped into the deep lake, but others drowned with the boat. I jumped. I cried with fear. I saw dozens of people in the water, but nobody could help them.
It's reported that the boat carried 45 life jackets. Even if those were accessible, there wouldn't be enough if the ferry was this overloaded.
They're like not even close to enough. They have like less than a quarter of what they need.
So Sinar Bangun remained capsized on the surface for a time, with survivors clinging to the hull. A lot of these are the passengers who've been riding on the vessel's top.
It's what we always say, right?
Be somewhere where you can be thrown free of the boat.
Yes.
That's not enclosed, so that's a lot of who's in the water. A lot of the passengers in the first and second deck, which is enclosed, are trapped inside the boat. Kind of similar with, I mean, it's the same thing you'd have in any situation, but we had this in the Paisley Canal disaster, where you had the inside portion packed with people, and when it starts to capsize, no one can get out because there's so many people.
Yeah, I would imagine if the boat's only supposed to have 45 people, and you're putting 150 people in that below section, you can't move until the person in front of you moves, and like in a panic, like no one gets out. It just doesn't work.
So according to local police chief Paulus Waterpau, speaking after the incident, less than half the people on the boat were able to get out before it sank. And we'll see that that is technically true, but it's a lot less than half, probably. Witnesses reported that other vessels in the area came to attempt to render aid, but that worsening weather and the high waves made that difficult. One official reported that at least half a dozen boats were participating in those search and rescue efforts.
Yeah, that's really unfortunate, like in this situation specifically, that they're able to get such a great response for rescue and recovery, but the weather just makes that so difficult to do.
And another thing here that I think also doesn't it certainly didn't cross my mind until I read about it, was the water in this lake is reportedly quite cold, which you don't necessarily think about
right
in Indonesia. But I guess just given the geology of the lake, maybe that is why that happens. So in the initial hours after the sinking on Monday evening, local police confirmed 1 death and 18 survivors rescued from the water. That 1 death meaning that's the 1 body they recovered. So the original estimate of the missing was 49, and that was working from a rough estimate that there were about 80 people on board. So kind of like your estimate at the beginning, kind of assuming this thing is going to be at least double its capacity. That's
right.
just,
Yeah, like I assume they're going to cram some people on there, but like it sounds like it's beyond what anyone would really conceive of unless you're a ferry operator, apparently.
But with no records, no passenger manifest, officials really just had to slowly build this estimate higher based on friends, relatives reporting that someone had been on the ferry and they were missing.
So there's no manifest whatsoever?
No. No record at all. The high end of that estimate was later revised to 130 missing. The official number of survivors never changed. That stayed at 18. Although, just like with the official death toll, that number could also be higher.
Yeah, I suppose, right? Like you may just not even want to talk about it. And like,
yeah, I mean, if you get picked up by like a fishing boat or something, whatever, you make it to shore, maybe that's the end of it. So shaky numbers all around here. And that 18 survivors, that's particularly heartbreaking because, there's video of this that's taken from the upturned hull by a survivor on their cell phone. And the boat's almost fully ringed with survivors. And that's a lot more than 18 people who are close to some level of being safe. And they don't end up making it.
Yeah, yeah. So the people on the hull some of them were rescued, though?
Yeah, so the hull, it stayed capsized for a bit and then it sank entirely.
Okay.
Some of those on the hull presumably didn't survive.
I mean, I think we always have stuff like that with, like, I remember, like, the Empress of Ireland, you have reports of people sliding off and things like that as they get too weak.
Yeah, and so there's a video that that person taking the video from the hull. The versions that I saw, it kind of cuts from that to them getting onto their boat that rescued them. So I don't quite know the process of if they were taken off the hull or from the water. Those videos also give you a really good sense of the wind. It's extremely loud in the videos, and you can see what it's doing to the waves. You can see people on one of the boats that's helping out. They're getting ready to try to throw life jackets into the water to people. And, every time they're about to, the wind is just so strong that they can't do it because they know it's going to get blown away. Some people were rescued because, life rings were thrown to them and they were pulled on board. So by Wednesday, so this is 2 days after the sinking, the estimate of those missing rose to 192, which put obviously the total occupants of the boat well over 200.
Yeah, like that is absolutely crazy.
Or about 5 times what she was, quote unquote, supposed to have. Quoting here from the Straits Times on June 21st, 2018.
The authorities have struggled to provide accurate information regarding the number of people on board the ill-fated boat. With the ship sailing without a permit known as an SIB and the operator refusing to release a manifest, a document listing the vessel's cargo, passengers, and crew. It is unclear if such a document exists.
So with this sinking, there was an enormous public outcry, not just for the incident itself, but for what survivors and relatives thought was a lackluster recovery attempt from the government, and specifically from Indonesia's National Search and Rescue Agency, which is known as Basarnas. It's an acronym.
That's interesting because, like, I was thinking the same thing. It seemed like this was just local vessels. I didn't hear a lot of organized efforts about search and rescue.
So the chief of Basarnas at the time, Siaugi, again, one of our single named individuals, he described the work being done as an all-out effort, and the agency also reported that based on where it sank, the ferry may have been at a depth of 490 meters, or about 1,600 feet. With the available equipment and personnel, divers were only able to descend to about 50 meters or 164 feet.
I think that's a pretty fair defense on their part as far as like, other than rescuing people from the surface, like you weren't doing anything else. Like once it sank.
A big factor in this was recovering their bodies. But that's like a whole different thing. Even if they're able to identify where this is, it's an entirely different thing to be able to get it back.
Right.
The waters of the lake are described as cold and very dark. A diver with the Indonesian Navy, Koko Hadi Wiratama, reported,
"It's dark. We can only communicate by direct contact between divers' bodies. It's heavier when we want to ascend. It feels heavy."
So the last part, that's a reference to the reduced buoyancy of fresh water compared to salt water. So, him and other divers described how difficult it was to dive just due to the temperature, the depth, and the lack of visibility. So given the limited capabilities of the government and, that really difficult location, Basarnas Chief Siaugi requested international help in the recovery.
"We will do our best to salvage this wreck. Because we do not have robots, we are trying to find them from other countries. But most of them have tools to lift a vessel from just 100 meters depth, and the wreck must be cut first."
Like you were kind of saying in a defense of the search efforts, there's a limited amount of things they can do, and there's even a limited amount of things that people who might help them can do. Quoting from Suwarni, the mother of a 20-year-old son who was lost in the sinking along with his girlfriend,
"Millions of questions keep me from sleeping. Why a boat for just 50 people is allowed to be loaded with almost 200 people plus dozens of motorcycles? What kind of government is this that can't protect their own people from unnecessary accidents? And after the accident, they're not able to find the victims. I beg help to everyone to quickly find my son and his girlfriend, even if there remains. Please find my son. Return him to me."
So there's a lot of those sorts of accounts in a lot of the news things you read. A lot of people frustrated that they can't even get their loved one's remains back. But yeah, there's real challenges stopping that from happening.
It's kind of a quick observation that popped into my head. I don't know there's really any meaning behind it other than kind of the obvious. But I was just thinking that in a lot of these ferry cases, we hear from victims' families about how important like getting the body back is. But in a lot of the more, sailor stories, the old like sailor maritime stories, it feels like that body recovery isn't ever something people talk about. For like merchantmen and stuff like that, I feel like it's almost more accepted by everyone involved that like, oh, this person might just disappear.
I think also there's probably also a little bit more of a sense of this is where this person belongs. Not in the sense that, they deserve to be dead, but the fact that if they're going to be somewhere not with us, they should be with their ship. I think especially those older sailing stories where there is that relationship between sailor and vessel.
Yeah, where it truly is your like life.
Where else would you want to be buried, right?
Right here with the podcast, Mike.
I can see that playing a role. It's a really interesting observation that I hadn't thought of.
Yeah, it's just something that kind of popped in my head with this, that we're seeing that trend. Like I said, I don't know that it means a whole lot. It's kind of obvious, but just something interesting to think about.
So it's generally agreed that overcrowding is the cause of the loss of the Sinar Bangun. But just how overcrowded is the real sticking point? Indonesian Transportation Minister Budi Karya Sumadi questioned the possibility that there were 200 or more people aboard.
"I say it is possible to carry 80 people, but 200 people wouldn't fit. The potential for overcapacity is there, as the ship operator was reluctant to release the manifest and had no SIB. There is no recorded indication of wrongdoing."
Yeah, there's no recorded indication because there's no passenger manifest.
Right.
That was a frustrating quote because, like, if that's what's exonerating this person, then, like, maybe this is why people aren't keeping logs because they know that if they don't write anything down, they didn't technically do anything wrong.
Also, I would say if it sank with 80 people on it or 200 people on it, it doesn't matter.
Because it's still overloaded.
It's still double capacity and it would sink, right? Like, So to say like it is possible to carry 80, then like it's almost like when you catch a serial killer and it's like he killed 40 people and like, well, we're going to get him for 3 of them. It's like we don't need to do the rest. Like we have this here now.
Well, one survivor, survivor Hernando Linga, who was interviewed on the Indonesian language program Hitam Putih, which means black and white, he estimated that there were 180 people on board. This is one of the Indonesian language sources that I used for this, and you can hear him estimate 180, 180. And so in that interview, Ando, which is what he goes by, he also describes the boat as shaking for the entire time from when it left port to its capsizing.
That's interesting. Shaking, like vibrating, or shaking like the waves tossing it around?
Vibrating because it's carrying so much stuff. You can probably think that the engine's probably straining here. Because maintenance also probably not a top priority.
I am sure it's not.
Ando managed to get to the surface floating on a piece of debris. I think he said some kind of helmet, maybe one of those motorbike helmets. I don't know. Those are buoyant.
Something that might have caught some air.
That's an interesting video to check out. We'll share that link in the show notes. I have very rudimentary knowledge of Indonesian, mostly based on my capstone course from senior year of college. I've been trying to get back into it for this to get a little bit more out of those Indonesian language sources. The Indonesian news agency Kompas reported in July 2018 on some of the practices of the ferry operators on Lake Toba. And speaking with Jatior Sinaga, the owner of Sintadame, which is a vessel that's pretty similar to Sinar Bangun. So according to Sinaga, the vessel has an allowable capacity of 45. So talking about his vessel.
However, during the holidays, we cannot refuse the passengers' requests. So the ship was often overloaded.
I would argue that you can.
I was about to say, what's stopping you from saying no? I mean, I feel like if I go and yell at the ticketing agent that I didn't get on my standby flight, then I get tased by the cops. So, like, you can say no.
Yeah, and that's kind of one of the things that comes after this is reassessment, restructuring of, okay, like, we're going to stick to these limits and whatnot. And in any of these situations where, you know, someone's directly making more money, if more people get on the boat, these things are going to happen. We see these happen in all kinds of contexts. You had it with the Sultana.
A tale as old as Steamboat Time.
Yeah, like any of these situations where that's the case, this is going to be an interest because that's a natural conflict of interest. I want more money and I want my ship to be safe. So which one of those is going to win out? So in addition to, and probably also related to, the issues of overcapacity, letting too many people on these boats, the qualifications of the captains and crew came into question. Basically wondering who is allowing 200 people to get on a boat that's supposed to carry 40.
That's a good question.
So the same Compass article features an interview with a then 26-year-old skipper on Lake Toba, who reported that he'd been captain on the lake for a year and a half without any formal certification. He had 10 years as a crew assistant on these boats, so he knew how they worked, but just didn't have the formal training. When he did go to get certified, the process he described was, we would say, less than rigorous. He said he was never tested on his knowledge or ability, and he was only asked for his ID card and, quote, cigarette money.
I mean, that seems exceptionally cheap. I would want like steak money or something.
He says, quote, I gave the cigarette money when the certificate was ready. Certificate is in quotes here. The certificate he received was a handwritten document explaining that he was the captain of his ship, and it was signed by the local transportation head.
It has a very Michael Scott quality to it.
It's like the internet thing where it's like the person, it's like a little kid showing their ID and it just says like, I am 21.
Yeah.
In some versions, it's a dog, I think. But it's that, basically. So that report further reveals that existing regulations were not being followed regarding the licensing of vessels over 7 gross tons, which were required to be certified at the provincial level, while smaller vessels could be certified at the lower district level. There were no provincial officials assigned at the port on Samosir, even though the majority of the boats operating on Lake Toba are above that tonnage threshold. So you can kind of see this is just kind of a blind spot in the regulation atmosphere. this is somewhere that's kind of off the main path of, this isn't, a seaport. This isn't somewhere where international traffic is coming and going. You kind of get the sense that they felt like they could just kind of let this one be.
Yeah, it feels like it just doesn't have like the national level resources that something that it doesn't do, that does do international trade would have. It would be like if the Great Lakes didn't have as many like Coast Guard stations or something.
So Indonesian President Joko Widodo put out a statement calling for the overhaul of the transportation industry and a review of safety standards for water transportation. So in terms of more concrete steps taken by the government, there were several changes proposed in the aftermath. One of these was simply to follow the existing legislation, which did require ships to undergo annual testing for seaworthiness and to have a passenger manifest and SIB. Vessel operators on Lake Toba were also called to a meeting with government officials to share safety information. The government also said that there would be audits for vessels in the area and that they would not be allowed to operate until they were in compliance with regulations.
Is this being enforced by like the Indonesian Coast Guard or like local police? Does it specify?
I believe Basarnas would be in charge of enforcing that, but probably with the help of...
Was that like a state level?
Yeah, that's like a national level.
Okay.
Federal, that's kind of their search and rescue.
I realized by saying state level, that would be particularly confusing, especially international listeners.
The transportation minister also promised 75 billion rupiah, which is just over $7 million, to the improvement of dock infrastructure on Lake Toba. About 100 new Port Authority personnel were hired for Lake Toba in an attempt to increase that culture of safety on the lake.
That's cool. So you are seeing that investment, sounds like, more at a national level.
I wasn't able to really find much saying yes or no. Are these things being enforced? I don't believe there have been any incidents since this one, which is good, on this lake. So maybe some of those things have been working. And yeah, I mean, Indonesia, we talked about this before the show. They're known for having some of the best search and rescue capabilities in Asia. We said they're a maritime nation. They have a lot of resources and training for this stuff in certain contexts. But the Indonesian archipelago has such a wide range of demands you might find yourself having. You just can't possibly have on hand all the resources you might need for every situation and the ability to deploy them where they might need to go. And Lake Toba is a great example. It's this isolated area. It's not accessible from the sea, but it's one where you need more of your deep sea style equipment to do any sort of thorough search or recovery mission here. Yeah, it's just a particularly hard environment here. So I'd like to wrap up with another quote here. This is kind of the end of what we have to present here. This one is coming from a 61-year-old father and grandfather, Muhaimin, who lost 8 family members on the Sinar Bangun.
My sons, my daughters-in-law, and my grandchildren have been the victims of greedy businessmen who just want to take advantage of the holiday season without thinking of people's safety. It would not happen if they follow the rules, but they made money over our misery.
For anyone curious, the captain and several other operators were arrested in the aftermath of this. So the captain did survive.
Interesting.
I don't know the situation behind that, or the process of his survival or what. I just wasn't able to find any sort of information about that, if anyone has it. So there was, legal action taken. I don't know what the ultimate findings on that was for any of those people that were, held responsible for this. But that really tells the whole story, that quote there that we just heard from this.
Yeah.
The money takes precedence over everything else.
Yeah, I think that's what we see in these stories. That kind of links a lot of these ferry stories together. It does tend to come down to that. And I mean, we see it so often, even in a lot of these, sometimes it is just the weather or human error. But I think the ones that are sometimes the most tragic are the ones that are kind of just more neglect, which is probably what happened in this case.
So I think that wraps things up here. We'll share those sources in the show notes. Again, there's a few videos of different length you can find. Video from survivors, as they're waiting to be rescued, after they've been rescued. There's quite a lot of news segments and things covering this. but most of it's in Indonesian. Even if you're not listening for content necessarily, you can still get quite a lot from the interviews. The general vibes. You can see a lot of good visual representations of some of these things we discussed. So with that, I think we will sign off for this week, and we will be back next week with another episode for you.